You'll never walk again." The words weren't just a diagnosis. They were a death sentence to a little girl's dreams, until her father decided to fight the impossible with nothing but love, sweat, and a toolbox. Before we dive in, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story will absolutely blow your mind. It started with laughter. The kind of laughter that comes only from children when the world feels endless, safe, unbreakable. Emma's sneakers slapped against the cracked blacktop of the school playground, her pigtails bouncing like twin pendulums as she outran 3 friends in a game of tag. Her cheeks were pink, her arms pumping, her eyes lit with the thrill of being 12 and untouchable. Parents on the sidelines barely looked up from their conversations. Kids fell and scraped knees every day. But then came the slip, the wrong angle, the sharp twist of a foot on loose gravel, and a sound no one was ready for. A crack, distinct, unnatural. Then silence, followed by a scream that tore through the entire neighborhood. Children froze. Teachers ran. A whistle blew somewhere, shrill and useless. Emma lay twisted on the ground, her face pale, her mouth open in a cry that was more animal than human. One of her friends shouted her name. Another darted toward the office, screaming for help. Within minutes, the sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the spring air like a blade. Mark arrived at the hospital just as they were wheeling her past double doors, her small body strapped to a gurney, IV already taped to her arm. He caught only a glimpse of her tear-streaked face before the doors swung shut again. His wife, Hannah, stood against the wall, shaking so violently her coffee spilled down her blouse unnoticed. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it to her chest, as though even touch would shatter her further. The waiting room was a purgatory of beige walls and 2 bright lights. A vending machine hummed in the corner, spilling its artificial glow over empty chairs. Hannah sat hunched forward, burying her face into the coat she clutched like a lifeline. Her sobs came in waves, muffled, desperate. Mark remained on his feet, his jaw clenched tight, eyes locked on the sterile white floor tiles. He didn't blink, didn't move. It was as if standing still could hold the world together a second longer. When the surgeon finally appeared, the smell of antiseptic seemed to follow her. Her mask dangled from one ear, her expression a mask of its own. Professional, detached, rehearsed. She spoke in clipped words about complications, a miscalculated incision swelling around the spinal cord. Hannah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with horror. And then came the words, delivered flatly, as if they were reciting a fact from a textbook. "She'll never walk again." The sentence fell into the room with the weight of a tombstone. Hannah collapsed against the chair, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. She pressed her coat to her face to stifle the sound, but it only made the moment more suffocating. Mark didn't cry. He didn't yell. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at the floor, jaw so tight the muscles in his temple trembled. The words echoed louder than the sirens had earlier, louder than Emma's scream, louder than anything he'd ever heard in his life. Never walk again. The surgeon waited for questions, for outrage, for something. When none came, she gave a short nod, mumbled something about arranging physical therapy consultations, and left. Hannah's shoulders shook beside him, but Mark still didn't move. Not until the door clicked shut. Only then did he force himself to breathe, slow and heavy, like dragging air through stone. He walked down the hall, ignoring the sympathetic glances from nurses, ignoring the way his legs felt heavier with every step. When he reached the ICU, he paused at the door. Behind the glass, his daughter lay dwarfed by wires and machines, her face pale, lips dry. The fluorescent lights made her look smaller than she was, fragile in a way she had never been before. Mark pushed the door open quietly. He crossed the room, each step deliberate, each inhale sharp. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the tangle of tubes. His hand hovered above her forehead for a moment before settling there gently, stroking back damp strands of hair. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, glazed with medication, and a whisper escaped her cracked lips. "Dad?" His throat tightened, but he forced his voice steady. "I'm here." She tried to shift, but the machines groaned and her face twisted in pain. "Am I okay?" she asked, her voice so small he almost wished she hadn't spoken. He swallowed the lump in his throat, leaning down until his lips brushed her temple. "You rest," he murmured. "Let me worry about the rest." She sighed, drifting back into the haze of anesthesia. Mark sat there for a long time, the steady beep of the monitor filling the silence. He thought about her laughter on the playground, the way she had begged him just last week to push her higher on the swing. He thought about her shelves of sketchbooks, half filled with drawings of castles and horses, her big plans of running track in the spring. And then he thought about those words: cold, mechanical, final. Never walk again. He bent lower, kissed her forehead with lips that trembled despite himself, and then, in a whisper so soft it belonged only to her and the quiet walls of the ICU, he said the words that would shape the rest of their lives. "We'll see about that." He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But he knew one thing with the certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. He would not let "never" be the final word spoken over his daughter's life. The weeks blurred into each other, stitched together by the sterile glow of hospital lights and the endless chorus of machines. Emma was no longer introduced by her name, but by her case file, her condition reduced to acronyms and test results that fluttered in the hands of doctors who spoke about her as though she weren't in the room. Each morning began with fresh wires taped to her skin, X-rays slid into machines that hummed indifferently, charts clipped to the end of her bed like scorecards in a game she hadn't agreed to play. Mark watched the white coats circle her like vultures. They pointed at scans, muttered terms he didn't fully understand, and scribbled notes without once meeting Emma's eyes. When they did speak to him, their words were dipped in sympathy, polished with a professional coldness that only made the blow sharper. "It's time to focus on realistic expectations," one neurologist said, adjusting his glasses with clinical precision. "Adaptation, not recovery, should be the priority." Another doctor handed over a stack of pamphlets with pastel covers: "Living with Disability, Building Accessible Homes, Support Groups for Parents Like You." The words were meant to console, but they felt like gravestones pressed into his hands. Hannah read every page. She nodded along to the doctors, highlighted paragraphs, and wept quietly into the brochures at night. She wanted to believe them, maybe even needed to. Acceptance, they called it. But Mark couldn't bring himself to swallow the word. Acceptance meant surrender, and surrender meant letting his daughter's laughter die in exchange for ramps and rails. He watched Emma when no one else was paying attention. She sat in her chair, sketchbook balanced on her lap, her pencil moving across paper with stubborn determination. Sometimes he caught her staring at her legs, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. More than once, he saw her try to wiggle her toes beneath the blanket, the tendons in her neck straining with effort. Nothing happened, but she tried again, every day, as though some part of her refused to believe what the white coats had declared final. At night, when the hallways were quiet and the nurses dimmed the lights, Mark would slip outside, leaning against the cold brick of the hospital wall. He'd light a cigarette he didn't smoke, let it burn out between his fingers, and mutter into the empty night. "She doesn't need your pity," he said once, his voice breaking into the dark. "She needs a chance." The words weren't for the doctors. They were a promise to himself. The doctors liked to talk about impossibilities, drawing neat lines between what could and could not be. But Mark remembered the way Emma had once run barefoot across the yard, her hair wild, her laughter chasing fireflies into the dusk. He remembered the bruises on her knees, the way she always got up again, faster than before. He remembered her voice when she had asked him, after the fall, if she was broken. He'd lied then, told her she wasn't. Now he understood that he had to prove it. Every time they said, "Wheelchair for life," he saw her sketches of herself standing. Every time they handed him pamphlets about support groups, he heard her whisper, "I'll try again." Every time they told him to prepare for ramps and handrails, he saw a spark in her eyes that reminded him she hadn't given up, not completely. He went home one evening, sat in the garage surrounded by the smell of oil and sawdust, and stared at his tools. They weren't medical instruments, weren't machines designed by experts. They were just what he had. But maybe, just maybe, they were enough. If the doctors had given up, he decided, then he would not. He couldn't. Because Emma wasn't broken. She was waiting for someone to believe in her as fiercely as she still tried to believe in herself. And if that someone had to be him, then so be it. Mark crushed the cigarette into the dirt, wiped his hands on his jeans, and whispered to the night, "We'll find a way." The white coats could keep their cold words. He was ready to fight fire with faith, even if it burned him alive. Mark wasn't an engineer, not in the way people usually mean. He didn't own blueprints or degrees or certificates to hang on a wall. What he had was calloused hands, a back that ached after 12-hour shifts, and a brain wired to listen when machines complained. At the factory, when gears ground or belts slipped, he was the man they called. He didn't diagnose with formulas. He crouched down, touched the steel, listened to the rhythm, and somehow knew what piece had given up. At home, he was the same. When the washing machine rattled, he fixed it. When Emma's bike chain snapped, he had it working before she finished crying. When she asked for a birdhouse, he built one, with a roof that slanted just enough to make her laugh. But grief is a cruel kind of tutor. It reshapes a man until he does things he never thought possible. And so, after another day of doctors speaking like prophets of doom, after Hannah had cried herself to sleep in a hospital chair, Mark drove home alone. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind that pressed against your ribs until you wanted to scream. He walked past the living room, past Emma's empty bedroom, and finally to the garage. The door groaned open, revealing shadows and the stale scent of sawdust, rust, and motor oil. He flicked on the light. The bulb buzzed weakly overhead, throwing pale light across chaoses. An engine block half taken apart on one bench, bicycle wheels stacked like forgotten promises in the corner, toolboxes with their lids half open, screws and bolts scattered like coins on the floor. To anyone else, it was junk. To him, it looked like a language he almost knew how to speak. He stood in the center of it, staring at the clutter, his chest rising and falling in measured breaths. He thought about Emma's face, the way her eyes had locked on his when she'd whispered, "Am I broken?" The way she had gripped his hand with all the strength left in her body when she begged, "Help me stand." That look had branded itself into his mind, and he carried it now like a weight too heavy to drop. "I'll figure it out," he whispered, into the empty garage. His voice cracked on the last word, but it didn't matter. No one was there to hear it, but the tools. He walked to the old workbench, brushed aside a pile of screws, and pulled out a battered notebook from the drawer. Its cover was creased, the spine frayed, pages filled with grocery lists, sketches of shelves he never built, measurements for projects long forgotten. He flipped to a blank page. For a long moment he just held the pen, his hand trembling. He had no plan, no knowledge of biomechanics or prosthetics, only the echo of his daughter's voice in his head. Then, with slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote one word in the middle of the page, "Walk." The letters looked awkward, uneven, but staring at them, something shifted. It was a declaration, a promise, a seed. He circled the word, underlined it twice, then began to sketch. At first, the drawings were childish, stick figures, crude shapes of legs bound by braces, little arrows pointing where motors might go if he could find any. He tore pages out, crumpled them, tossed them into the corner, but kept drawing. Hour bled into hour. By the time the bulb flickered, threatening to die, the notebook was filled with half-formed ideas and notes scrawled in the margins: weight balance, torque, joints, support. He leaned back on the stool staring at the mess. To anyone else, it was nonsense. To him, it was the beginning of something. He imagined Emma strapped into a frame, her legs guided forward by motors, her body lifted just enough to remind her what standing felt like. It wasn't science yet. It was stubborn love given shape in ink and grease. The garage was silent except for the faint buzz of the bulb. He closed the notebook, set it carefully on the bench, and pressed his palms flat against the wood. His hands were shaking, but his resolve was not. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a father, and in that garage, surrounded by broken parts and forgotten tools, he decided that was enough. Emma's voice used to fill every room she walked into. She was the kind of child who narrated her world as she lived it, describing the shapes of clouds, the smell of fresh-cut grass, the way her pencil always seemed to dance when it hit paper. She would chatter through car rides, telling stories about dragons that lived in the neighbors' hedges, or why the moon probably got lonely when the sun was out. Silence had never belonged to her. But after the accident, it moved in like an uninvited guest and refused to leave. Days passed where she said almost nothing. She sat in her wheelchair, small shoulders hunched, sketchbook balanced on her lap. Sometimes she filled page after page with drawings, legs in motion, birds taking flight, staircases that went on forever. Other times she stared at the ceiling, tracing patterns only she could see. When it rained, she wheeled herself to the window, resting her chin in her palm as she followed raindrops racing down the glass. The girl who once filled their home with noise had become a stranger wrapped in silence. Her friends came at first, loud and awkward, bringing balloons and stuffed animals. They hugged her quickly, glanced at the wheelchair, then at the floor, and sat in stiff silence, not knowing what to say. They talked about school, about gym class, about who had gotten faster on the track team. Emma listened, but didn't join in. After a while, the visits grew shorter, then stopped altogether. The empty space they left behind was heavier than their words ever were. Mark tried to fill the silence. He told her about the garage projects he was tinkering with, about the neighbor's dog that had escaped again, about how he once almost broke his ankle trying to climb the old oak tree in their yard. But his words fell like stones into a well. No splash, no echo, no reply. Each evening he told himself tomorrow would be different. Each evening he left her room with his chest aching from the weight of what wasn't said. One afternoon, when the air outside was thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth, Mark wheeled in a tray of sandwiches. He tried for lightness, tried for the old rhythm of their banter. "You know," he said with a grin, "you're still faster than me in Mario Kart." At least one race I'll never win. He waited for the giggle, the eye roll, the comeback that used to come so easily. But Emma didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. Instead, she lowered her pencil, let it roll across the page, and whispered a question that tore through him like shrapnel. "Dad, am I broken now?" He froze, tray still in his hands. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Those 5 words echoed louder than the doctor's verdict, louder than the machines that beeped and whirred around her hospital bed. He set the tray down carefully, almost reverently, and knelt beside her chair. He took her face in his calloused hands, forcing his voice steady, when everything inside him threatened to collapse. "Never," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Machines break. People fight." Her lower lip trembled, and she looked away, but the words settled somewhere in her, fragile as glass, but present. She picked up her pencil again, sketching furiously as though trying to outrun the question she had asked. That night, when the house was still and Emma finally slept, Mark sat alone at the kitchen table. His hands covered his face, his shoulders heaving silently. The tears came, hot and relentless, not just for the accident, but for the hollow space where his daughter's laughter used to live. He realized then that her silence wasn't just quiet, it was surrender creeping in at the edges. If he didn't give her something to hold on to, if he didn't find a way to show her that broken was not her story, he would lose her long before he ever lost her legs. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, sat up straighter, and whispered into the dark, "I'll find a way." Emma's silence had become more than a weight. It had become fuel, and he would burn every last drop of himself before letting it consume her. The first design was born in desperation, not brilliance. Mark sat at the workbench with his battered notebook open, a pencil smudging against paper as he tried to capture what his heart already knew, but his hands didn't. The sketches were rough, almost childish, stick figures with boxes strapped to their legs, crude gears that spun in directions that wouldn't work, arrows pointing nowhere. He filled the margins with half-thoughts, words like supportez-moi, balance, muscle. It looked more like the doodles of a bored schoolboy than the beginnings of something that might carry his daughter's weight. But he kept drawing. Night after night, when the house was dark and Emma's breathing was steady in the other room, he pressed on. He taught himself in fragments, piecing together knowledge like a man fumbling in the dark. YouTube became his classroom. Videos of engineers explaining prosthetic joints played on loop until the voices blurred into a kind of mantra. He read articles in medical journals, though half the words sent him scrambling for a dictionary. Physics textbooks, long buried in boxes from his own school days, found new life under the dim bulb of the garage. He studied leverage, torque, weight distribution. Concepts he once thought belonged only to classrooms now became lifelines. Scrapyards became his treasure hunts. He walked through aisles of twisted metal and discarded machines with the patience of a prospector. He ran his fingers over rusted bicycle frames, tested the resistance of old motors pulled from washing machines, and bargained for steel rods no one else wanted. He hauled it all home in the back of his truck, ignoring the raised eyebrows of neighbors. To them, it was junk. To him, it was raw material, waiting for purpose. The work took a toll. His hands blistered from grinding metal, skin cracking under grease and heat. His back stiffened from bending over parts for hours. More than once he sliced his palm or burned a finger on a welding torch. But every time the pain threatened to stop him, he closed his eyes and pictured Emma before the accident, her laugh ringing out as she darted across the yard, her legs pumping like pistons, her hair flying behind her. That memory kept him steady when exhaustion begged him to quit. Slowly, impossibly, the chaos began to take shape. The stick figures transformed into something closer to blueprints. Hinges appeared where knees should bend, braces wrapped around drawn calves. Tiny motors, sketched in shaky pencil lines, promised to mimic the pull of tendons. He knew it wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't professional. But it was more than scribbles now. It was a plan, however fragile, for his daughter to stand again. He built the first frame from scavenged bicycle parts, welded into crude brackets. The braces were lined with pieces of worn leather he salvaged from an old recliner, padded just enough to imagine comfort. The joints squeaked when he moved them, and the motor he bolted in whirred unevenly, like a dying fan. He strapped it to a mannequin leg borrowed from a thrift store and held his breath as he switched it on. The thing jerked once, shuddered, and then wobbled on its stand, a puppet with strings tangled. Within seconds it collapsed into a heap of metal and leather. Mark crouched beside the mess, wiping sweat from his brow with a sleeve already streaked with grease. His chest rose and fell, disappointment heavy in his lungs. It had taken weeks of scavenging, late nights, and every ounce of energy he had, and all it managed to do was tremble and fall. For a moment, he thought about quitting. For a moment he heard the doctor's voices in his head, reminding him of what was impossible. But then he imagined Emma's eyes, the way she had once asked him if she was broken, the way she still tried to move her toes under the blanket when no one was watching. He ran his hand over the twisted frame, as if touching it might coax it into something more. And then he whispered, barely louder than a breath, "It's a start." It wasn't success, it wasn't even close, but it was proof that failure wasn't final, that effort could be shaped into progress, and that one man's love might one day outbuild an entire world of doubt. The garage no longer looked like a place to park a car. It looked like a war zone. Tools lay scattered across the concrete like abandoned weapons. Bolts rolled under benches like shrapnel, and scorch marks from welding torches painted black scars across the floor. Each night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Mark would retreat into this chaos, his sleeves rolled high, his hands raw, his eyes red from too many sleepless nights. The air was thick with the tang of burnt metal and the bitter smoke of his stubbornness. Grinding wheels screamed long past midnight, sparks showered like angry fireworks, and the sound of metal collapsing onto the floor became as familiar as the tick of the kitchen clock. More than once he slammed his fist against the workbench when something failed. A curse would slip out harsh and low, and then he'd start again. He didn't allow himself to stop. Failure was only another sketch in his notebook, another path crossed off. The neighbors weren't as forgiving. Complaints started with polite knocks on the door, escalated to sharp words over the fence, and ended with thinly veiled threats about calling the city. His boss at the factory noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way he moved slower than before, distracted, half present on the floor. "You all right, Hollis?" he asked once. Mark lied, said it was nothing, but the truth clung to him like oil. He was running on fumes, and everyone could see it. Even Hannah began to break under the weight of his obsession. She stood in the doorway one evening, arms crossed, face pale with exhaustion. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice trembling between anger and despair. "She needs you to accept this, Mark." "We all do." But he couldn't. He wouldn't. To accept it felt like betrayal. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He just turned back to his bench, tightened another bolt, and let his silence answer for him. Money disappeared faster than time. Savings drained to nothing. Then came the credit cards. When those maxed out, he slipped off his watch, the one Emma had once wrapped around her wrist and declared way too big, and pawned it without hesitation. Every dollar became another length of wire, another motor salvaged, another joint reforged. He didn't think of it as loss. He thought of it as fuel. Each failure, brutal as it was, taught him something. The first model toppled forward, and he realized weight needed to be shifted back. The second buckled at the knees, and he understood joints weren't hinges. They needed to mimic the subtle bend of muscle. The third refused to balance at all until he learned how to stabilize the frame with braces that could flex without snapping. Every collapse, every spark, every pile of useless metal became a teacher. "Good," he muttered. Each time something crashed to the floor. "Now I know how not to do it." By the end of the month, the garage had transformed. The shelves were lined with scraps that no longer looked like junk, but like parts of a greater puzzle waiting to fit. Blueprints, once messy sketches, now spread across the walls in layers, annotated with arrows and measurements he barely had the energy to write. Half-built braces stood propped in the corner, wires dangling like veins, waiting for life. The workbench, once for fixing bicycles and building birdhouses, had become an operating table for experiments born of equal parts desperation and hope. It didn't look like progress to anyone else. To Hannah, it looked like madness. To the neighbors, it sounded like a nuisance. To his boss, it explained the half-finished shifts. But to Mark, standing in the glow of the single buzzing bulb, sweat streaking down his back, hands trembling from another night of labor, it looked like possibility. He stood in the middle of it all one night, wiping grease from his face with the back of his wrist. Around him, the battlefield was littered with casualties, failed braces, broken motors, cracked welds. And yet, instead of despair, something steadier burned in his chest. He wasn't finished. He couldn't be, because each broken piece whispered to him in its own way, telling him he was closer than before. The garage had stopped being just a place to build. It had become a vow in steel and sweat, that Emma's silence wouldn't be permanent, that her question, "Am I broken?" would one day be answered by the sound of her footsteps. The Saturday morning sun slanted through the garage windows, painting the floor in stripes of gold and dust. Mark had been awake since before dawn, pacing the kitchen with coffee gone cold in his hands, going over every bolt, every wire in his head. He'd tested the frame 100 times on the mannequin leg, on his own weight, even bracing it against the wall to see if it would hold. But this wasn't about metal anymore. This was about Emma. When he wheeled her into the garage, his palms were sweating against the handles. Emma blinked against the sudden light, her sketchbook balanced across her lap. She looked around at the chaos of the room, the scraps, the soldered joints, the half-finished blueprints taped to the wall. But what caught her eyes was the thing in the corner. It looked more like a relic from a science fair than a miracle. 2 metal braces connected to a crude frame, straps lined with old leather he'd salvaged from a torn recliner, motors that whirred when touched, wires running like veins. It was clunky, awkward, undeniably homemade. To anyone else it was ridiculous, but to Mark it was everything. Emma's eyes widened. "Dad, what is that?" He crouched in front of her, his voice steady but trembling with something bigger than nerves. "It's hope," he said. She stared at him, confused, cautious. He didn't give her time to argue. With gentle arms, he lifted her from the chair, his muscles straining but steady. He slid her into the braces, adjusting the straps one by one, pulling them snug against her legs. The metal was cold, the leather stiff. Emma flinched at the weight pressing against her body. "It's heavy," she whispered. "I know," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "So is the world, but let's see what happens when you try." He stepped back, just enough to give her space, but not enough to let her fall. The motors hummed to life with a faint mechanical growl. Emma's face tightened as she gripped the handles, her arms trembling with effort. She shifted her weight, trying to move her foot forward. For 1 second, it looked like something might happen, but then the joint seized, the motor locked, and the whole contraption lurched. Emma pitched forward, and before she could crash, Mark caught her in his arms. Her face crumpled, tears spilling before she could stop them. "I can't," she choked, her voice breaking. "I can't do it." He steadied her, holding her upright even as the braces clattered uselessly against the floor. "Not yet," he said softly. But Emma shook her head violently, her hair whipping across her cheeks. Anger flooded where sadness had been. "I don't want to be your experiment," she spat, her fists clenching. "I don't want to be strapped into your machines just so you can pretend I'm not broken." The words cut deeper than she knew. Mark's throat tightened, but he didn't argue, didn't defend himself. He just leaned close, his voice low and steady, carrying more truth than all the blueprints in the world. "You're not my experiment," he whispered. "You're my miracle." Emma turned her face away, her jaw set hard, refusing to let him see the tears that still fell. He unstrapped her quietly, lifting her back into the chair with care, as if she were made of glass. Neither of them spoke as he wheeled her back into the house. The garage felt heavier without her in it, the silence pressing against his chest like failure itself. But he didn't tear the machine apart. He didn't quit. He cleaned the straps, tightened the bolts, and whispered the same 2 words to the empty room that he had whispered to her. "Not yet." That night, after the house had gone quiet, Emma sat cross-legged in bed with her sketchbook open. Her pencil moved slowly at first, then faster, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finished, she looked at the page. A drawing of herself, not in the chair, not lying in bed, but standing. Her small figure was upright, legs braced, head held high. She traced the lines with her finger, her lips pressing into something almost like a smile. She closed the notebook gently, slid it under her pillow, and whispered into the dark, "Maybe." Days blurred together in the soft hum of the garage and the clatter of tools. Emma avoided it at first, retreating to her room whenever she heard the whir of motors starting up. She didn't want to see the machine that had betrayed her, the heavy metal frame that had made her feel weaker instead of stronger. To her it was proof of what she couldn't do, and sitting in her chair felt easier than standing in failure. Mark never pressured her. He kept working quietly, sketching new angles, shaving weight from the braces, adjusting straps until they no longer dug into skin. The garage became his second skin, the smell of grease and burnt metal clinging to him even at the dinner table. He barely spoke of his progress, though his eyes betrayed hope every time she wheeled by. One night, restless, Emma padded toward the garage door. She peeked through the crack and saw him slumped at the workbench, his cheek pressed against a page of blueprints smudged with pencil lines and coffee stains. His hands, stained black with grease, were curled into loose fists, as though even in sleep he refused to let go of the fight. The lamp above him cast a tired yellow glow, catching the edges of his face and the hollows under his eyes. He looked worn, older than she remembered, but there was something in the way his body had simply collapsed beside his work. It wasn't obsession, not really. It was devotion. He wasn't building a machine. He was building her hope. Emma lingered there, her throat tight, before rolling quietly back to bed. She didn't sleep much, not because of pain this time, but because of the image of him fighting for her in silence. The next morning, as the smell of coffee filled the kitchen, she wheeled into the garage doorway and watched him adjusting wires with careful precision. He looked up, startled, wiping sweat from his brow. Before he could speak, she said softly, "Let's try again." His hands froze mid-air. "Are you sure?" Emma nodded, her heart thudding. "I want to." Mark moved quickly but gently, like someone handling glass. He rolled the frame forward, checked every strap twice, then lifted her carefully into place. The braces hugged her legs snugly, less clunky than before but still heavy. She gripped the handles, biting her lip. The motors whirred to life, steadier this time, their hum like a low promise. "Okay," he whispered, steadying her arms. "One breath, just one." Emma inhaled sharply, shifted her weight, and pressed down with trembling strength. The machine groaned, but held. Her knees buckled slightly, the braces wobbling, but she didn't fall. For a heartbeat, then another, she was upright. Her breath caught in her throat. Mark's eyes shone, wide and wet. "Look at you," he whispered, the words breaking like glass. Emma's lips twitched into something she hadn't felt in months, the smallest, most fragile smile. She stood there, legs shaking, the machine wobbling beneath her, but she was higher than the chair, higher than despair. She was standing. For the first time since the accident, the world tilted back into perspective. She wasn't looking up at everyone else from wheels. She was eye level, her chin lifted, her chest rising with something like pride. The garage didn't feel like a prison of tools anymore. It felt like possibility. Her arms trembled, her shoulders ached, and she knew she couldn't hold it for long. But for those few seconds, she wasn't broken. She was fighting. When she finally eased back down, her breath came fast, but her eyes were brighter. "I did it," she whispered, half to herself, half to him. Mark crouched in front of her, brushing her damp hair from her forehead. "You did more than that," he said. "You reminded me why we don't stop." It wasn't walking yet, not even close, but it was standing. And in that moment, both of them knew it was enough to begin again. Word spread faster than Mark ever intended. It started with the metallic whir drifting through the open garage window, strange and unfamiliar against the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. Then someone glimpsed Emma standing, her frail frame strapped into the clunky exoskeleton that groaned with every adjustment. By the end of the week, curious neighbors began drifting over, lingering on the driveway, peering in with folded arms and skeptical eyes. Some gasped softly when they saw her upright. "Look at that," one man whispered, almost in awe, as though witnessing a ghost rise. A young boy clapped, grinning wide. "She's like Iron Man," he shouted, unfiltered, and Emma blushed despite herself. There were those who smiled, those who encouraged, who muttered things like, "That's incredible," and "What a fighter." For a fleeting moment, the garage felt less like a battlefield and more like a stage. But not everyone saw progress. Some saw danger. "That's not safe," one woman said sharply, shaking her head as if she were watching a car accident unfold. "She could fall and break something worse." Another man leaned on the fence, muttering, "You're just giving her false hope. She'll never really walk, not like that. You're setting her up to be crushed." Their words slipped through the air like poison, seeping into Emma's fragile courage. She lowered her eyes, her grip tightening on the handles, her breath catching, as though every whisper was a weight added to her shoulders. Even Emma's doctor, when she learned of the contraption, was not impressed. She sat across from Mark in the sterile exam room, her tone sharp enough to slice steel. "Do you understand the risks?" she demanded. "You could cause permanent spinal damage. This isn't medicine, Mr. Hollis. It's recklessness." Mark sat still, his hands folded tightly in his lap. He listened, nodded politely, and said nothing. He had grown used to the sound of doubt. He recognized it now for what it was: fear disguised as authority. That night, when the house was quiet and Emma lay curled under her blanket, Mark returned to the garage. He tightened bolts, welded another piece, adjusted the motor so it wouldn't seize again. The sparks lit up his tired face, but he didn't flinch. He knew critics always appeared the moment something threatened their definition of possible. People were comfortable with limits, with neat categories. What scared them wasn't failure. It was proof that they might have given up too soon. When Emma wheeled into the garage the next morning, her face pale from remembering the voices, she asked in a small, uncertain tone, "Dad, what if they're right? What if this is just pretend?" He set the welding torch down and crouched beside her. Her eyes were wide, searching, as though the answer he gave could decide the rest of her future. "They'll understand when you walk," he said softly, steady as stone. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes. "Promise?" Mark took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around her small, trembling ones. He gave her palm a firm squeeze. "Promise," he whispered. Emma studied his face, the certainty in his voice, the unshakable steadiness of his grip. And though doubt still lingered like a shadow, she let herself believe him, if only for a moment. She nodded, tucked her sketchbook against her chest, and whispered, "Okay." The critics' voices might have been louder, but in that garage, with the hum of motors and the scent of burnt metal hanging in the air, Mark's promise was the only one that mattered. The weight of it all pressed heavier with each passing week. The credit card statement stacked on the kitchen counter like silent accusations. The rent notice, stamped in red, glared at him from the fridge. Hannah barely looked at him anymore, her eyes tired, her voice clipped when she spoke at all. "We can't keep living like this, Mark," she whispered one night. But he was already lacing his boots, already heading back to the garage. The garage had stopped being just a workshop. It was a battlefield and a sanctuary all at once, a place where sparks flew like fireworks and failures clattered to the floor with a hollow clang. Every weld that cracked felt like a personal betrayal. Every motor that sputtered and died reminded him of the thin line between hope and futility. He worked until his hands blistered, until the veins in his arms throbbed, until his vision blurred with exhaustion. But still he stayed, hunched over metal and wires, because leaving meant facing a house full of bills, silence, and despair. Emma had been patient, more patient than any child should be asked to be. She endured the straps and the motors, the endless adjustments, the falls into his waiting arms. But patience is fragile, and hers finally snapped one night when another prototype gave way beneath her. The braces jerked once, locked, and then collapsed, sending her weight crashing against his chest. He caught her, as always, lowering her gently back into the chair, but this time she didn't just cry. She erupted. "I hate this," her voice cracked, sharp and raw. "I hate this stupid machine. I hate you trying. I hate all of it." Mark froze where he stood, his chest heaving, sweat dripping into his eyes. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the workbench, the metal biting into his palms. For a heartbeat, he wanted to shout back, to defend himself, to scream that he was doing this for her, that every sacrifice, every blister, every sleepless night was because he couldn't stand the thought of her giving up. But the words stuck, choking him. Emma's face was twisted with fury and pain. Her small fists balled tightly in her lap. Her tears streaked down her cheeks, not quiet this time, not hidden, but loud, angry sobs that echoed in the cluttered garage. It wasn't just about the machine. It was about the weight of being a child, asked to carry something so much bigger than herself. Mark's breath came ragged, his body trembling from more than fatigue. Then slowly, he let go of the workbench. The clang of tools rattling against each other filled the silence as his hand slipped free. He turned, slid down against the cold wall, and sank to the floor. His elbows rested on his knees, his face buried in his calloused hands. "I can't," he whispered, his voice hoarse, barely louder than the hum of the cooling motor. "I don't know how to stop fighting for you." Emma's sobs slowed, her chest still rising and falling in jagged bursts. She stared at him, stunned. For the first time, she didn't see her father as the unshakable man who always knew how to fix what was broken. She didn't see the relentless fighter who faced every failure with clenched fists and burning eyes. She saw something else, someone fragile, worn thin, desperate not to lose her twice. Once to the chair, once to despair, her tears quieted. She wheeled closer, the sound of rubber against concrete loud in the stillness. She didn't speak, not yet, but her small hand reached out and brushed his sleeve. He looked up at her, his eyes red, his face streaked with sweat and grief. Neither of them said another word. They didn't have to. The silence was enough. In that moment, Emma finally understood that the machines weren't just about walking. They were about keeping him alive too. And Mark, broken on the garage floor, realized that no amount of welding or wire could carry them forward if they didn't learn to fight together. Help came when Mark least expected it. By then, the garage had swallowed him whole. Scrap metal piled in corners, failed braces leaning like broken soldiers against the wall, and the smell of burned steel hanging thick in the air. He was running on fumes, his hands raw, his notebook filled with more crossed-out sketches than ideas that worked. Then one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the houses and the neighborhood fell into its evening hush, a knock rattled the side door of the garage. When he opened it, an older woman stood framed in the fading light. She leaned on a cane carved from oak, her silver hair tied into a loose bun, her eyes sharp and appraising. She didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, she looked past him at the chaos inside and let out a dry laugh. "You're building with heart," she said, her voice carrying both approval and disapproval in equal measure. "But heart needs math." Mark blinked, too surprised to answer. She stepped inside uninvited, her cane tapping against the concrete floor. "Name's Alvarez. I used to design prosthetics for veterans before I retired. Word around town is you've been playing God in your garage." She turned her gaze to the half-finished frame on the bench. "And making a mess of it." Normally, Mark bristled at criticism, especially from strangers. But something in her tone, blunt but not cruel, firm but not dismissive, stilled his defenses. He crossed his arms, wary. "And what makes you think you can do better?" Mrs. Alvarez smirked. "I don't need to do better. I just need to make sure you don't kill your daughter with that death trap." She tapped the brace with her cane, and it wobbled pitifully. "This thing has all the stability of a newborn deer on ice." Emma, who had been sketching quietly in the corner, looked up with wide eyes. She was used to people telling her father he was wasting his time, used to the size and the warnings. But this woman's words were different. They weren't rooted in doubt, they were rooted in knowledge. Mrs. Alvarez stayed longer than she intended that first night. She pulled a notepad from her bag and began sketching diagrams with steady hands, explaining torque as though it were as simple as stirring soup, weight distribution as though it were a recipe to be followed. She pointed to Mark's steel parts and shook her head. "Too heavy. You need lightweight alloys. Scrap steel won't do unless you're building a tank." Mark listened, really listened, his pen scribbling notes as fast as he could. He felt like a schoolboy again, hunched over a desk, desperate not to miss a word. For once, the garage wasn't filled with the sound of grinding metal or angry curses. It was filled with learning. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Alvarez returned again and again, sometimes with her cane, sometimes with samples of materials she still had stored from her work. She taught Mark how to calibrate joints so they mimicked the natural bend of a knee, how to adjust the motor's pull so it worked with Emma's weight instead of against it. She corrected him with sharp words, but softened them with the occasional smile when he got something right. Emma watched it all from her chair, her eyes following the way her father leaned in, nodding, jotting down every detail. For the first time she saw him humbled not by failure but by guidance. He wasn't just fighting blindly anymore. He was learning, growing, reshaping his stubborn determination into something sharper, smarter. One evening after Mrs. Alvarez left, Emma wheeled up beside her father as he studied the new designs. "She knows what she's doing," Emma said softly. Mark looked up from his notes, exhaustion lining his face, but hope shining through his eyes. "Yeah," he admitted. "She does." Emma tilted her head. "Does that mean maybe this isn't impossible?" Mark closed the notebook, set it gently on the bench, and knelt so his eyes were level with hers. He reached out, brushing her cheek with his thumb. "It means," he whispered, "that impossible just got a little smaller." For the first time, standing in that cluttered garage under the dim hum of the single bulb, it didn't feel like they were chasing ghosts. It felt like the impossible was bending, reshaping, maybe even breaking. And in its place, possibility was being born. The frame looked nothing like the first one. Gone were the clunky braces that squeaked with every adjustment. Gone the heavy steel that weighed Emma down like chains. This new design gleamed under the garage light, sleeker, lighter, every curve intentional. The straps were padded with soft fabric Mrs. Alvarez had suggested, the joints calibrated to bend the way real knees did, the motors tuned so their hum was steady instead of stuttering. It wasn't perfect. It still looked homemade, rough around the edges, but it felt different, alive somehow, like it was waiting for her. Emma eyed it with suspicion, her arms folded tight across her chest. "It looks smaller," she said, doubt dripping from her voice. "It's lighter," Mark replied, crouching to adjust a strap. "Means it'll move with you instead of against you." She hesitated. Memories of past failures clung like ghosts. She remembered the lurches, the falls, the way her face burned with humiliation when the machine locked up and left her dangling like a puppet. But she also remembered the look on his face when he worked until dawn, the grease smudged across his cheek, the trembling in his hands. He hadn't stopped, and maybe, just maybe, this was why. Reluctantly, she let him lift her into the frame. His hands were steady, his voice low, guiding her into place. The straps clicked, one by one, firm but not suffocating. He stepped back only when he was sure she was secure. The motors hummed to life, their sound smoother now, like the purr of something patient. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just try." One step. Emma gripped the handles, her palms damp with sweat. Her heart thudded in her chest. She shifted her weight forward, bracing herself for the lock, the collapse. But it didn't come. The joint gave, hesitated, then caught itself. Her foot scraped forward. A step. She gasped, the sound sharp in the still garage. Mark froze, his lungs seizing as though even breathing might shatter the moment. Her lips parted, eyes wide. "Dad?" The word trembled out of her, half disbelief, half wonder. "I moved." Tears blurred his vision before he could stop them. He pressed a fist to his mouth, then lowered it, laughing shakily through the tears. "You didn't move, duh," he whispered, stepping close, his hands ready as she tried again. "You walked." The second step was shakier, her knees trembling under the effort, her shoulders straining. But she did it. 2 steps. Then the weight overwhelmed her and she sagged, collapsing forward. Mark caught her before she could fall, lifting her gently back into the chair. His arms cradled her as though she were still a little girl with scraped knees, as though she hadn't just shaken the world with 2 fragile steps. Her breath came fast, shallow, but her eyes were blazing with something he hadn't seen in months. Fire! She clutched his sleeve, her lips trembling. "I walked," she whispered again, almost in awe. "You did," he said, his voice breaking. "You really did." That night, long after Mark had fallen asleep at the kitchen table with his head resting on a pile of notes, Emma sat cross-legged in bed with her sketchbook. The pages were already filled with drawings of herself standing, holding handles, braced by frames. But tonight she didn't draw standing. She drew running. The pencil scratched furiously against the paper, forming lines of movement, her hair flying behind her, her arms pumping, her legs free of braces, her feet touching the ground as though they belonged to her again. She shaded the smile on her face brighter than anything she'd drawn before. When she finished, she traced the outline of the runner with her finger, her lips curling into a small, secret smile. For the first time since the accident, she didn't dream of what was lost. She dreamed of what was coming. Hope has a way of making the world brighter, even if just for a little while. After those first trembling steps in the garage, Emma carried herself differently. She sat taller in her chair, her sketches more daring, her eyes flickering with sparks of possibility. For the first time since the accident, she wanted to take the machine outside the garage. "I want to try at school," she told Mark one morning, her voice firm. "I want my friends to see." He hesitated. The garage was one thing, safe, controlled, with his arms always ready to catch her. The world outside was less forgiving. But when he looked at her, he saw more than a child in a chair. He saw a fighter who deserved the dignity of being seen, trying. So he agreed, against every voice of caution in his head. The day of the test, the gym was cleared. Teachers gathered at the edges. Parents murmured from the bleachers. Emma stood strapped into the sleekest version of the device yet, her hands gripping the handles, her father crouched beside her with every nerve in his body stretched tight. The machine hummed steadily, responding as she shifted her weight. One step. Applause broke out. Another step. The hum of voices rose with excitement. For a moment, it felt like victory was no longer a dream. And then, disaster. A motor locked mid-step, jerking violently. Emma's knee buckled, the brace twisted, and before Mark could catch her, she fell hard onto the gym floor. The sound of her body hitting the polished wood silenced the room. She gasped, her face scraping against the floor, her ribs slamming against the edge of the brace. Blood bloomed in a sharp red smear across her cheek. Parents rushed forward, their whispers cutting like knives. "This isn't safe." What was he thinking? "She's just a child." The applause had turned into condemnation in seconds. Teachers looked away, some shaking their heads. The school board convened within hours, summoning Mark to the principal's office. "You're endangering her," the principal said, her voice clipped, almost rehearsed. "This isn't just irresponsible, it's reckless. We cannot allow experiments like this on school grounds again." Mark sat stiff in the chair, his hands clasped tightly, his throat dry. The words pierced deeper than the accusation. They pierced because he already believed them. He had failed, not in theory, not in sketches, but in flesh and blood. His daughter had been hurt. The image of her lying on the gym floor replayed over and over in his mind, each time worse than the last. He left the office carrying a weight so heavy it almost broke him. That night, Emma lay in bed with bandages across her cheek and her ribs wrapped tight. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic hiss of the humidifier. Mark sat beside her, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He didn't know what to say. He expected anger, blame, maybe even silence. What he didn't expect was her small hand reaching for his. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thin but steady. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "Don't quit. Please." He shook his head, his voice breaking. "I hurt you, Emma." I promised I wouldn't let you fall. And I did. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, even through the pain. I'd rather fall trying than never try at all. The words hit him harder than any scolding, harder than the whispers of the crowd or the principal's condemnation. She wasn't broken. She wasn't done. And if she hadn't given up, how could he? He leaned down, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "All right," he whispered. "We'll keep fighting." In that moment, the fire that had almost been smothered roared back to life. Her courage became his fuel, her resilience his blueprint. The setback had left scars, yes, but it had also carved something unshakable into both of them, the certainty that forward, no matter how painful, was the only way left to go. The nights grew longer, and so did Mark's hours in the garage. He worked until his eyes burned, until the sun crept over the rooftops and the neighbors' alarms began to sing. The sound of grinding metal, the hiss of the welder, and the scratch of pencil against paper filled the hours when the rest of the world slept. Sometimes he didn't realize how much time had passed until he noticed the silence, the kind that came only when dawn had stolen the darkness. Emma began to wander in more often, sometimes barefoot, sometimes still clutching her sketchbook, her hair mussed from sleep. At first she would just sit quietly watching him. Then she started sketching her own ideas, flipping her pad toward him with shy determination. "What if it bent more like a bird's leg?" she asked once, tapping the page where she'd drawn a joint angled backward. He studied it, surprised, then laughed softly. "You're the real engineer," he told her. And she smiled, one of those rare, cautious smiles that reminded him of who she used to be. The garage shifted in those nights. It wasn't just his battlefield anymore. It was their workshop, their secret place. He would tighten bolts while she scribbled notes. She would point out things he missed, how a strap pressed too tightly, how a brace looked heavier on one side. He listened, always, because her eyes saw things his weary ones overlooked. In her sketches, she wasn't trapped in a chair. She was running, climbing, laughing. And for him, those drawings became blueprints as important as any diagram. Their conversation stretched deep into the night, carried on the hum of motors and the smell of oil. Sometimes they talked about the machine, sometimes about nothing at all. They joked, they dreamed, and slowly, the silence that had once haunted Emma began to loosen its grip. She wasn't the chatterbox she had been before the accident, but she spoke more now, her voice soft but steady, filling the empty corners of the garage with hope. One night, while Mark adjusted a motor, Emma set her sketchbook down and stared at him, her face unusually serious. The machines quieted, the air heavy with the weight of whatever she was holding back. "Dad," she said quietly. He looked up, a wrench still in his hand. "Yes, sweetheart?" Her eyes searched his, steady and vulnerable all at once. "If I walk again, will you promise me something?" His chest tightened. He set the wrench aside, wiping his hands absently on his jeans. "Anything," he said, and meant it. She hesitated, then whispered, "Promise you'll stop calling me broken." The words sank into him like a blade. His throat closed, his eyes stung, and for a moment he couldn't speak. All those nights he had tried to protect her, to shield her from the world's cruelty, and still she had absorbed the doubt, the whispers, the pity. She had heard the word broken too many times, from others, and maybe unknowingly from him too. He knelt in front of her, his rough hands trembling as he cupped her face. "You're not broken," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not now, not ever. Machines break. People fight. And you've fought harder than anyone I've ever known." Her lip trembled, but she held his gaze, waiting for the promise. He swallowed hard, forcing the words past the knot in his chest. "Deal, he whispered. "I'll never call you broken again." Her smile was small, but it glowed brighter than any sparks in the garage. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. The machines were silent, the night was still, and in that quiet, A promise was made that carried more weight than all the steel he had welded together. From that night on, the garage wasn't just the place where they built a machine. It was the place where they built each other back up, one sketch, one bolt, one whispered dream at a time. It happened on a Sunday morning, quiet and unassuming, the kind of morning where the world seemed to move slower. The sun poured through the garage windows in golden streaks, catching the dust in the air and turning it into something almost holy. Mark had been up since dawn, pacing, double-checking every strap, every bolt, every calibration. He told himself not to hope too much, not to expect miracles. But deep down, something in him was trembling, like a man about to open a door he'd been afraid to knock on. Emma wheeled into the garage, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. "You're jittery," she teased softly, raising an eyebrow at him. "Not jittery," he said quickly, his voice cracking just enough to betray him. "Just ready." The machine stood waiting in the middle of the garage. It was different now, sleeker, balanced, as though all the failures and long nights had been quietly refining it into this moment. Emma looked at it, then at him. For a long time neither spoke. Finally she nodded. "Let's try." He wheeled her close, then lifted her gently into place. His hands moved with the care of someone cradling glass, checking every strap twice, pulling each buckle snug but not too tight. The motors hummed awake, steady and low, like the sound of a heart readying itself for something big. Emma gripped his hands, her palms damp. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "Ready?" he asked, his own voice barely a whisper. She took a breath, nodded. One step. It was small, shaky, her foot dragging more than lifting, but it was a step. The sound of her shoe scraping against the floor echoed louder than thunder in Mark's chest. He froze, hardly daring to breathe. Then another. Her knees wobbled, her arms trembled as she leaned on him, but the braces caught her, steadied her. For a second she faltered, and he thought it might all collapse again. But she pushed through, her face tightening with sheer will, and her foot slid forward. And then another. 3 steps. Enough to break the weight of months of silence, enough to shatter the image of her forever confined to a chair. Tears filled Mark's eyes, blurring the sight of her moving, but he didn't care. His voice cracked as the words escaped him, trembling and raw. "You're walking." Emma's lips curled, and for the first time since the accident she laughed. Not the nervous laugh she'd used to hide her fear, not the quiet chuckle she offered out of politeness. This was her laugh, bright and unbroken, ringing through the garage like music. Step by step she shuffled forward, slow and awkward, the machine whirring in protest. But she didn't stop. Neither did he. They moved together, father and daughter, bound not by steel and straps, but by something far stronger, defiance. By the time she reached the other side of the garage, both of them were crying openly. Mark pressed his forehead to hers, his chest heaving with joy and disbelief. She clutched his arm, her face streaked with sweat and tears, her smile so wide it hurt to look at. "It wasn't graceful," she gasped, laughing between breaths. "It wasn't even fast." "But it was walking," he said firmly, his voice breaking again. She nodded, still laughing, still crying. It was ours. They collapsed together into the chair, holding onto each other as though letting go might undo it all. The machine hissed as it powered down. The garage fell back into silence, but the air was different now. It carried the weight of something holy, something one. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. Emma had walked, and nothing, not the doctors, not the whispers, not the failures, could take that away from them now. The video wasn't meant for the world. Mark had recorded it just for himself, shaky hands holding up an old phone, while Emma shuffled forward in the garage, her laughter filling the space as if it were bigger than any cathedral. 3 steps, that was all. But when Emma begged him to send it to her best friend, neither of them thought much of it. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. First, it was the local community page. Then someone shared it to a disability advocacy forum, and within days, it was splashed across timelines worldwide. Millions watched, millions shared. People cried, watching a 12-year-old girl in a homemade contraption take steps they were told she never would. The comments poured in. Words like miracle, hope, inspiration. Families with children in wheelchairs wrote messages begging to know how it worked. Veterans messaged, saying it reminded them of rehab, of struggle, of something they thought they'd lost. By the end of the week, reporters were showing up outside the garage, their vans clogging the street, their cameras waiting for a glimpse of Emma. Neighbors who once muttered complaints about the late-night sparks now smiled proudly for the cameras, calling the Hollis family heroes. Headline spun, "Factory Worker Defies Science for Daughter's First Steps." Mark hated it. The world wanted a story, a spectacle, a headline that sold. But to him, it wasn't a stunt. It wasn't some viral moment. It was sacred. It was Emma. He kept the garage door closed when the reporters came knocking. He said little to the microphones shoved in his face. Every time Emma wheeled up beside him, curious about the commotion, he crouched down, his hands steady on hers. "This isn't for them," he told her, his voice low, unwavering. "It's for you." Emma nodded, her eyes shining. "Then let's keep going." Still, the world pressed in. Engineers from universities sent emails offering their expertise, some with genuine admiration, others with thinly veiled offers to take over the project. A tech company sent a letter asking for licensing rights. Mark read them all, then tossed most into the trash. He didn't trust men in suits who saw his daughter's steps as profit margins. And the critics came, louder than before. Doctors wrote open letters warning that what Emma was doing was unsafe, that permanent spinal damage was a real risk. Medical panels scoffed on television. "It's a stunt," one said. "A dangerous one." On social media, skeptics sneered. "This isn't science, it's desperation dressed up as engineering." Emma read some of it. She saw the words, felt the sting. One night she asked, her voice trembling, "Are they right, Dad? Is this just you pretending?" Mark dropped the wrench in his hand, sat on the concrete beside her chair, and looked her square in the eye. "Do you feel like you're pretending when you stand? When you take a step?" She shook her head. "No." "Then that's the only truth that matters." For a moment silence stretched between them, heavy but steady. Then Emma smiled, small but fierce. "Okay, then let's keep going." So they did. While the world argued, they worked. While cameras begged for a glimpse, the garage hummed quietly with motors and laughter. While doctors warned of danger, Emma strapped herself in, sketchbook always nearby with drawings of the life she imagined on two legs. The world might have noticed, but the world didn't own it. Theirs was a battle fought, not in headlines, but in the quiet of a garage, in the grip of her hand around his, in the whispered words that fueled every step. "This is for you." The morning air carried the smell of fresh grass and damp pavement, the kind of crispness that made everything feel like a beginning. Months of long nights in the garage, of sketches and welds and whispered promises had led to this, a stretch of road lined with banners, balloons, and a crowd that buzzed with anticipation. The local charity walk had never drawn such attention before. But this year, it wasn't just about raising funds. This year, everyone had come to see a girl who wasn't supposed to stand, take her place at the starting line. Emma stood there, braced in the newest version of the exoskeleton, the metal polished until it gleamed like silver in the morning sun. Straps hugged her legs firmly but comfortably, motors humming softly as though they too were waiting for the signal to begin. She clutched her father's hand, her knuckles pale with nerves. Around her the crowd pressed closer. Neighbors, classmates, reporters, strangers who had seen the video online and driven miles just to witness what they called a miracle. Cameras flashed, catching every angle of her trembling smile. Mark bent low, his voice steady, though his heart pounded like a drum. "Ready?" Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide but burning with determination. She nodded. "Ready." The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, the cheer of the crowd swelled, and then the walk began. Step by step they moved forward together. The first few were halting, the braces groaning with the effort, Emma's grip crushing her father's hand. But the crowd erupted anyway, clapping, shouting her name, tears streaking more than a few faces. Each step became more than metal and muscle. It was a defiance of every doctor who had said never, a refusal to bow to the word impossible. Mark kept his eyes on her, his hand steady at her back, ready to catch her if she faltered. But she didn't. She pressed forward, her teeth gritted, sweat beading at her temples. Every shuffle of her feet sounded to him like thunder. The mile stretched long, cruel in its distance. Halfway through, Emma's legs began to tremble, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Mark leaned close, whispering, "You can stop if you need to. No one will think less of you." She shook her head fiercely, her jaw set. "No, I want to finish." Word of her determination rippled through the crowd, and the energy shifted. People began to walk alongside her, some holding up signs that read, "Keep going, Emma." Others reached out, their voices breaking as they cheered. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see. Strangers wept openly, their tears mixing with applause that rolled like waves down the street. Step by painful step, Emma pushed on. Her braces clicked and whirred, her small frame swaying, but her eyes never left the finish line. Mark's heart ached with pride and fear all at once. He whispered encouragements, each one softer than the roar around them, but carrying more weight than any cheer. And then, at last, the banner stretched overhead, the finish line. Emma's knees wobbled dangerously, her arms shaking as she raised them higher, steadier, until they were above her head. Her face was wet with tears and sweat, but her smile blazed like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I did it!" she cried, her voice sharp, triumphant, unshakable. The crowd exploded. People clapped until their hands stung, sobbed until their throats hurt. Mark felt his chest split with pride, tears streaming freely down his face as he pulled her close, steadying her trembling body. Her legs were exhausted, her strength nearly gone, but her spirit soared above them all, untouchable. In that moment, on that small-town street, the world believed in miracles again, and Mark knew the truth, that the real miracle wasn't just that she had walked a mile. It was that she had carried the weight of doubt, fear, and pain further than anyone ever expected, and turned it into something the world could not ignore. The garage never went back to being just a garage. The smell of oil and sparks eventually gave way to the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. Where once there had been piles of scrap metal and scribbled notes pinned to the walls, now there were clean workbenches, shelves lined with carefully organized parts, and the quiet hum of machines being built, not for one child, but for many. Years had passed since Emma's first shaky steps, but the echoes of that day still lived in the air, guiding everything that followed. It began with one request, an email from a mother who had seen the viral video years before. Her son had been told the same thing Emma once had: "You'll never walk again." She couldn't afford the kind of equipment hospitals offered, and she asked if Mark might help. He hesitated, unsure if what he'd made in a garage could ever work for someone else. But Emma was the one who answered. "If we could build it for me, we can build it for him." That was the spark. From there, one request became 10. 10 became hundreds. So the garage grew piece by piece until it wasn't just theirs anymore. It became Emma's steps, a foundation built not on pity or profit, but on the belief that no child should be left behind because of cost or circumstance. The sign outside was simple, white letters on blue, bold and unshakable, Emma's name at the top. On opening day, families came from all over, wheelchairs rolling across the cracked pavement, parents clutching their children's hands with eyes full of both fear and hope. Emma stood at the entrance, taller now, older, but still strapped into her braces. She greeted each child with the same radiant smile she had once struggled to find for herself. Some of them stared wide-eyed at her, whispering to their parents. Others grinned openly, their courage borrowed from the girl who had once been told she was broken. Mark stood a few steps back, his arms crossed, his throat tight. He watched her bend to speak softly to a little girl whose legs dangled limp in her chair. He saw the way Emma placed her hand on the girl's sketchbook and asked what she liked to draw, as if she were speaking to a version of herself years ago. Pride swelled in his chest until it was almost too heavy to bear. When the speeches were over and the crowd had thinned, Mark moved closer. The late afternoon sun caught the braces on her legs, glinting like polished silver. She turned toward him, her eyes shining in that way they always did when words weren't enough. "They said you'd never walk again," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of all the years between then and now. Emma smiled, steady and certain. "Turns out," she said, her voice clear, "we just had to build our own road." The words hung in the air like a benediction. For Mark, it was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. He had started with desperation, with nothing but tools, sleepless nights, and a father's stubborn love. Now, standing beside his daughter at the doors of a place that bore her name, he realized they had created something far larger than themselves. Inside the workshop, motors whirred softly, waiting for small hands to reach for them. Sketches hung on the walls, not just Mark's crude diagrams anymore, but Emma's too, refined, detailed, filled with color. Children tested braces, some for the first time, wobbling, laughing, sometimes falling, but always rising again. Parents wept quietly in corners, clutching each other with the relief of finally being seen. Mark looked at Emma again, and, for a moment, he didn't see the braces at all. He saw a girl who had once asked him if she was broken, and a woman who had answered that question herself, not with words, but with a legacy. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is never wasted. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just change the way you see the world.